I'm Robert Ramsey, I work in the Air Office and I am a beef specialist focusing on beef systems.
I'm Lorna Shaw, I work in the Perth office as a ruminant nutritionist and my passion is beef and sheep nutrition.
I'm Helen Carty, I'm one of the vets based at SRUC in Ayr and I work in farm animal surveillance.
I'm Lorna Galloway, I'm a consultant in the Stranraer office with a specialism in soils, grass and fertiliser. 2022
has been a very interesting year. I think taking a look back, in 2020 everybody was very positive, new decade, new challenges and lots of opportunities, and then we saw COVID, now we've seen a war in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, a whole load of big macroeconomic stuff has come along, and yeah, the industry's been under quite a lot of pressure. Where I think we're at as farmers, so I think although the cost of living crisis is biting now in autumn 2022, it's biting for the consumer. I think that's basically our costs being passed on for the previous 12 months. So in 2021-22 we saw a real spike in most of our input costs, particularly feed, fuel and fertiliser, and that has put significant pressure on a lot of businesses, but it's also allowed businesses to take a step back, or forced businesses to take a step back and look at what really does work, what the technical efficiencies that they can make and how they can produce more stuff with less inputs.
The increase in fertiliser prices over the last kind of 6 to 12 months have really forced us to focus our attentions on the basics. We need to get down to understanding our soils, making sure our soil fertility and soil health is right before we even look at any purchased fertiliser. So although it's extra expense, it's been a big expense that's been added to the business, I think it's given us an opportunity to actually just a bit of attention to detail to the fundamentals of forage production by starting with our soils.
Yeah, so feed prices put a lot of pressure on businesses to look at efficiencies as closely as possible. Unfortunately, this year's forage is already in, so we don't have any control of quality, but it's forcing us to analyse quality, know what we've got on farm and balance that as closely as possible. We've got no room for waste in diets and we need to increase efficiencies and make the most of what we've got on farm at the moment. So advice at the moment is, look at a feed budget, know if your supply on farm meets your demand. If you do have supply issues on farm, plan ahead. If you are needing feed concentrate, think about bulk discounts if possible. Speak to feed suppliers as much as possible as well. They'll try and keep you updated and they might get a chance to get the best deal you can get. There is no thing as a brilliant deal at the moment, but every little helps. Look at quality, buy the best of what we can get and make the most out of it.
This year there's been a lot of challenges. One of the biggest challenges in the back end there has been lungworm has been a really big issue this year. So a lot of cattle at grass have been coughing, and that's going to have a consequence that there could be lung damage in calves and possibly in older cattle ahead of them being housed for the winter.
Helen, we down in the southwest, we have seen an increase in nematodirus in the autumn. That's out of season. What would your advice be on that?
So traditionally people have thought of nematodirus as being a spring issue. So an issue when you've got a mass hatch of the larvae on the pasture when the weather's warm enough and you've got lambs of a sufficient age to be eating that mass hatch of larvae. But not all nematodirus eggs need that cold snap for them to then hatch. And so it's probably in your area you've got the types of worms that don't need that cold snap first that's necessary to cause them to hatch in a mass way. So I think it's a perfect example that things don't stay the same. And particularly with parasites, they're really clever, aren't they, at changing and adapting to different circumstances. And so it's really important that we don't just worm our stock, whether that's cattle or sheep, just the way we always have done. So it's a really good opportunity looking forward to speak to your vet, see what's happened in previous years, but think about doing diagnostic testing at the appropriate time to see if there is a fluke burden, to see if there's a worm burden, to see whether we need to treat or not. Because the last thing we want to be doing is using treatments when we don't need to, because using these treatments at inappropriate times will lead to resistance.
And routine testing on your own farm will help you build the picture for how these challenges are changing over time.
Absolutely. So routine testing is part of it, but also thinking about how you can do things differently. So can you use fields in a different order? Can you use your cleanest grazing? So land that's been cut for silage that's not had cattle on it before, or if it's sheep, that's not had sheep on it before. Can you use that clean grazing for your most susceptible stock, and put your more immune stock on the fields that are likely to have the higher burden of contamination?
I think the interesting thing is where practice vets are at now, as well as the proactive, health planning discussions, is what they really want to do. They don't really want to be dealing with firefighting and big problems. The nice, exciting bit of the job is actually having proactive conversations with farmers, and we need to get better at discussing things, health planning with vets.
And I think farmers can get a lot more out of their vets by taking that approach, by thinking ahead of the problems, learning from their mistakes in previous years, and thinking, how can we address that? How can we prevent the same problems happening again? The worst thing we can do is repeat our mistakes.
I'm certainly a big advocate that we look at our forage production on a whole farm basis, whether that's the strategic use of different crops that are going to be more deep rooting. So as we're seeing changes to weather patterns, we've got more resilient crops in the summertime. But that sounds like your strategic use of fields for parasite burden is something that you can also factor into what and when you cut, and what and when you grow, and where you grow crops.
Yeah, and choosing the right fields for the right job to minimise the amount of treatments that you need to use saves on costs, and it also minimises the chance of resistance building up. So
Helen, Lorna would agree with me. We've seen a lot of, in the fertiliser world, we've seen a lot of people taking a P&K holiday, a lime holiday, and trying to reduce costs, direct costs in the soil world in the spring. We're now into the autumn. There are people now talking about vaccination holidays and maybe putting pressure on their inputs, so reducing their inputs. What advice have we got for those guys that are looking at their vet med costs and trying to reduce that input?
Yeah, so I think you need to have that discussion with your vet, because it needs to be tailored to your own farm. If you've got a farm where you've got cattle coming in, buying cattle from different sources, mixing of groups, probably the worst thing you could do is take a vaccination holiday, because you've got a whole mix of bugs, mix of pathogens that are all being put in the one shed together. If, however, you've got a more closed system, you've got a closed herd, you're only buying the very occasional animal, and you've got the opportunity that you can isolate that animal and you know what you're dealing with, then it might be that there are certain infectious diseases that are not on your farm. We've all worked really hard to try to ensure that we remove BVD from our herds. In some places, if you have good biosecurity, then perhaps you can remove the BVD vaccine, but you need to be absolutely sure that your cattle are not going to have access to other neighbouring cattle where BVD could still be an issue, or people are buying in cattle where BVD could be an issue. So it's really got to be tailored to your own specific farms. But there are some conditions that we know are pretty universal. So Clostridial disease happens all the time, happens every year. The vaccinations are fairly cheap, and they're very, very effective. And so if they save you one sudden death, then that probably pays for itself. As far as vaccinations for pneumonia goes, again, it depends on your system, it depends on your buildings. The likes of RSV, PI3, they'll be on all units. If you've got really good ventilation, so that these pathogens are not hanging about, that they're all getting blown out and blown through, and they're not getting the opportunity to take up disease, then perhaps you could cut back on these. But if there are any flaws in your system, that's when the likes of RSV and PI3 will show up. And so your vaccination is an insurance policy against clinical disease from these diseases.
When you mention BVD, I always have where we're at. I think it's where we were with sheep scab. We were nearly there. We would, we almost had it eradicated, and then we all took our eye off the ball, and the sheep scab story seems to be, increasingly problematic about the country. So I think on the BVD story, we need to just screw the nut and get this across the line.
Is our message there that it's not worth compromising on your health plan? There'll be some people who are overusers, but actually, should we be saying there's other things like the nutrition, the productivity of that animal is where you should be focusing, not on compromising health status.
So I think your vet med costs are likely to be lower if you're working with your vet and putting in preventative measures rather than trying to treat problems. So if you can get rid of the problems, if you can prevent the problems, you don't have to pay the cost of them.
I think by optimising health as well as nutrition, we can if we've got a really good productive animal that's already doing 1.2 kilos a day, but then it was challenged by pneumonia, for example, we're reducing productivity and it's unlikely we're going to get that productivity back. That also means we've got a longer time to finish in the shed. So we've got increased costs for that animal in the long run on top of your increased costs of vet and med as well. So it's worth putting that prevention in early and avoiding anything that might cause loss of production in the long run as well. So working with your nutrition and your management, your housing and your vet together to get the best result in the end of the day. So Lorna, we need to optimise forage to make sure we get the best results for stock nutritionally, but how do we also weigh that up against reducing costs of fertiliser?
Really, it comes back to soil health. Fertility on farm gives you flexibility about what crops you can grow, where you can grow the crops, and when you need the fertiliser for offtakes. So there's a fine line between saving money and compromising the quality of your forage. So certainly look to external sources for things like hen pen, or if you can import other organic manures to reduce your bagged fertiliser use. But we can't compromise on soil fertility because it'll just put us further down the road. So it's about knowing what you've got in your soils, what you're needing to put on to grow your crops, but also one of the other things that you can do is look at the crops that will fix some nitrogen for you, like legumes, red clovers, white clovers, and where they can fit in the system. But first and foremost, it's really about knowing what you've got underneath your feet to let you make the decisions from. So it depends on your system. In a lot of farms, there's scope to maybe grow some cereals so that you're reducing your reliance on purchased concentrates. Is there any particular crops you think would be best, Lorna?
Yeah, definitely. So if you're looking to reduce reliance on purchased concentrates, if you do have the ability to grow barley, wheat or oats yourself, that can really help to get a good source of energy into the diet, but also protein as well. The other option is looking at protein crops. As you mentioned, certain legumes such as peas and beans can be a really good source of protein into the diet and reduce protein costs massively on farm, while also having a benefit to the rotation and benefiting grass growth as well. So it's a nice double-edged sword, really.
It's a very interesting time we're in, that in the last 50 years or so we've had cheap nitrogen. Cheap nitrogen has really pushed us down specialist roles, you're a suckler farmer or a dairy farmer. Prior to cheap nitrogen, all farms were mixed farms, so there was a lot of crop rotations. There was a small amount of arable cropping, a small dairy enterprise, a small poultry enterprise, and I don't think we're going back to where our grandfathers farmed, but certainly in the current climate when things are expensive, it's interesting to see how the doors that are opening are some of those options that were used in the past. So growing some protein at home, growing a bit of white crop at home, maybe reducing overall stocking rate to try and increase your self-sufficiency at home.
Looking into 2023, number one, make the most of the funding that's available for soil sampling and get to grips with what the soil fertility is on your farm. Number two, look at options available to you for alternative sources of NP and K, whether it's hen pen, digestate, other manures. And the third one would be think about your forage and cropping system as a whole and think further than 2023. So look at where the gaps are in your feed supply in the system and be very targeted about how you overcome those gaps with home produced forage.
So my top 3 tips for looking forward to 2023 are making the most of your forage. Think about it early, try and make the best quality forage we can. It's always going to be the cheapest feed we've got on farm. Consider how your system can work best for you nutritionally. Do you have opportunity to grow more homegrown produce and make the most of that on farm? Or is there opportunity to maybe work with other farmers to reduce costs that way? And my third one is just try and make things as efficient as possible. We've got no room for passengers this year, so extra mice to feed on farm costs money as well. So streamlining things as much as possible.
We're at the end of 2022, and I think it's an opportunity for us to review what has happened and really critically appraise it with your vet so that you can put into motion what your plan is for the year coming up. So take the opportunity to put together a really sound herd health plan and a flock health plan, but not one that just goes in the drawer. Review it on a regular basis as problems crop up with your vet, address them, but also put them into the plan so that you know how to address that going forward to prevent making the same mistakes again. When you do have losses, don't stick your head in the sand, don't accept it. Make sure that you work with your vet to investigate what the problems have been so that we can minimise losses in the future.
So it's easy to dwell on all the negatives at the moment, but there have been quite a few positives in 2022. For me, it's been great to be back out and about. For us as a job, it's been great to be back out in farms, but also great to see farmers back at markets and particularly back at shows. These shows have been really well supported, and it's nice to see a bit of buzz back in the industry as well. This year we've had advance payments, which were gratefully received by most farmers across the industry, and also there is a lot of support out there just now for we're in an interesting transition type time, and there is support there through the Farm Advisory Service for an ILMP, an Integrated Land Management Plan, plus specialist advice plans that go with it. So that's when you get a specialist on farm, and basically we can tailor an advice package or tailor a report for your needs. And we also have an opportunity to do a carbon audit at the moment as well, which often we talk about carbon. We've got climate change targets, it's important we look at these, but for a farmer and a farm business, it's a really good tool, a really good way of looking at where the inefficiencies are in your business. And I always try and approach a carbon audit as a financial audit. So where are the holes in the business? Where can we plug those holes, and how can we actually make the business more efficient and therefore more profitable?